You don't need to be the best candidate to land six-figure roles. You just need to avoid these 5 mistakes that I've seen after interviewing 9,000 execs and helping them earn over $30 million in new salaries. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly what they are so you can stop making them and get hired for six-figure positions every time. Okay, so let's start with the first mistake. And this is one that explains why so many strong execs lose out in interviews. Okay, so imagine you're running late for an important meeting. Your phone battery's on 2%. You stop someone and say, "Excuse me, how do I get to King Street?" And instead of pointing you left or right, they start with, "Well, this town was founded in 1842. And you're standing there just thinking, "I don't need the history. Just tell me where to go." But that's exactly what most executives do in interviews. They're asked a simple question, and instead of giving a simple direction, they give a documentary. They try to impress, they over-explain, they start with the background, they defend decisions, and just hoping that they eventually land somewhere good. But hiring managers are busy, they're under pressure, they don't have time to pick the most impressive answer. They pick the one that's easiest to understand. And when your answers ramble, the interviewer has to work to understand you. And the moment they have to work, they switch off. And that's no bueno for you. Because the rule is clarity beats complexity every time. So instead of starting with the context, start with the headline. So if you were asked, "Tell me about a time you led a complex project," lead with the outcome and then explain only if needed. For example, instead of, "Well, let me give you some background on the project," you say something like this. "Sure, I led a complex rollout that was behind schedule when I joined. I reset ownership and priorities, and we delivered on time while reducing delays by 18%. Same experience, but very different impact." Now the interviewer understands you immediately, no guesswork. And when there's no guesswork, interviews feel easy. And that's why mistake number 1 is stop making your answers hard to follow. Okay, so if you found that useful, I break down this kind of interview psychology every week in my newsletter, including real examples of how senior candidates reduce risk and turn final round interviews into offers. There's a link in the description. Right, so here's something interesting. Even when your answers are clear and easy to follow, you can still lose the interview in the first few minutes. Because clarity isn't just about being understood. And that brings us to mistake number 2. Now obviously, first impressions matter, but something most executives don't consider is that interviewers aren't scored evenly from start to finish. They're front-loaded. So think of it like a movie trailer. If the first few minutes are confusing, vague, or weak, you just assume that the whole film isn't worth your time. And that's exactly what happens in interviews too. In the opening moments, the interviewer is thinking, "Do I like this person? Do I understand who they are and where they fit? And could I work with them?" And this really shows up in how you introduce yourself, how cleanly you explain what you do, and how calm or scattered your energy feels. And these early signals set the scene for everything else that follows. Because if you're clear and simple to follow, you earn the benefit of the doubt. The interviewer stops testing you and starts looking for reasons to say yes. And that's confirmation bias in action. But if you're confusing or unstructured, the opposite happens. Every answer gets scrutinized. Every pause feels bigger. The interviewer becomes harder for you because you made it harder for them. Now, most people think first impressions are about being charismatic or clever. They're not. They're about sending a clear, credible signal early. A simple, structured intro, a calm energy, and answers that quickly get to the point. Because once the interviewer understands you, everything else you say just lands better. And that's the real advantage of a strong first impression. And that's why mistake number 2 is stop making them work hard to understand you. Once the interviewer understands you and that first impression is set, something else is happening in the room. And it's not about your skills or your experience. It's about how it would feel to work with you. So picture this. You're lying in a hospital bed. You're about to have surgery. You're nervous. The surgeon walks in and says,
"Yeah, it's been a bit chaotic here today. I can't find all of my equipment, and I haven't had a break in hours, and management, they just keep changing direction. It's frustrating, but, we'll figure out."
Now, they could be technically exceptional, but the second they speak like that, your trust vanishes. And when the trust disappears, the thought of surgery becomes terrifying. Now, picture another surgeon walking in, and he says, "We've handled hundreds of these. Here's exactly what will happen." Now, they might have the same skills, but only one of them makes you relax and feels like you're in safe hands. And interviews are exactly the same. Because when 2 execs are equally capable, the offer will go to the one that feels like the lowest risk and the one who brings calm, not chaos to the interview. And that chaos just can show up in your answers. If you're rushing, interrupting, or just sounding frustrated about a previous employer. Now, none of that makes you incompetent, but it makes the interaction feel chaotic. The interviewer isn't wondering if you're smart enough. They're just asking themselves, will this person stay steady when things go wrong? Will they bring solutions, not problems? Will they reduce tension or escalate it? So before every answer, just pause. Ask yourself, does this sound calm or does it sound chaotic? So instead of an answer like this, leadership kept changing direction and it was frustrating. Try something simple like this. The environment changed quickly. I had to learn to prioritize and focus on outcomes. It might be the same reality, but there's two very different emotional signals because one sounds like stress and one sounds like leadership. And at senior level, you're not hired for intensity. You're hired for steadiness because the interviewer is asking, if everything goes wrong, do I want this person in the room? And if the answer feels like a yes, you're much easier to hire. And that's why mistake number 3 is don't bring chaos into the room. Okay, so that brings us to mistake number 4. Now, once the interviewer feels relaxed working with you, there's something else they're judging. Does this person sound like someone who owns decisions? And at the senior exec level, you're not hired just to do the work. You're hired for your judgment. So think about it like this. You're sitting on a plane at 30,000 feet. The cabin starts shaking. And you don't want the pilot to say
yeah, we're trying a few things, but we're just going to see how it goes.
What you want to hear is this. We're experiencing turbulence. We've adjusted altitude and we'll be clear shortly. There's nothing to be concerned about. Now, same turbulence, but one voice increases the anxiety while the other lowers it. That difference isn't skill. It's ownership and it's clarity under pressure. And at the senior level, that's what interviewers are listening for. Not what you worked on, but how you speak about the decisions you made, because that is authority. And interviewers work exactly the same way. But here's where I see execs go wrong all the time. They describe what happened, what the team did, and what they were involved in. They say things like we when the decision was theirs. They explain activity instead of judgment, hoping the interviewer connects the dots. But hoping someone sees your seniority is not the same as you showing it. Now, I once watched 2 execs interview for the same COO role. Both had led large transformations. Both had had very similar experiences on paper. And the first one said, we worked cross-functionally. We aligned stakeholders and we drove improvements across the business. Now, it sounded collaborative, it sounded good and involved, but the second one said this. When margins dropped 8%, I had 3 options. Cut headcount, raise prices, or redesign operations. Cutting headcount would hurt delivery. Rising prices would risk churn. So I chose to redesign the operations. We reduced waste by 12% and restored margin within 2 quarters. Now, same caliber perhaps, but very different signal. One sounded like a participant, where the other one sounded like the person who made the call. And guess who got the offer? Because authority isn't about the titles. It's about how you talk about your work. And senior executives, they anchor their answers around decisions. What options were on the table? What each option risked and what they chose and why. They speak in outcomes, not effort. And once you're seen as someone who can make clear calls, you're no longer just seen as a strong candidate. You're seen as the safest decision in the room. And that's why mistake number 4 is stop explaining effort and start demonstrating your judgment. And once you're seen as someone who can make decisions, there's still one last mistake that can quietly kill your chances. And that's leaving the interview vague at the end. Because by this point, you've done the hard part. You're clear, easy to follow, and you're calm to work with. And you really sound like someone who owns decisions. But here's where some executives drop the ball. They just finish a strong interview and they say, thank you, and then wait. But you wouldn't end a business meeting with, cool, let's see what happens. You'd agree on next steps, right? And if you're interviewing at a senior level, that's a non-negotiable. Hiring managers often have interviews back-to-back or rush from one meeting to another, and they rarely have time to discuss the next steps at the end of the interview. So if you don't guide the close, the momentum quietly dies after the interview. But here's the fix. Senior executives, they don't ask for reassurances. They create clarity. And right at the end of the interview, they lock in 3 things. The next step, the timeline, and what happens if that timeline slips. And it sounds like this. I really enjoyed the conversation today, but before we wrap up, could you walk me through the next steps and when I should expect an update? And once they give you a time frame, just add this. Perfect. If I don't hear back from you by then, is it okay for me to follow up? And that one moment does three things. It creates clarity, it creates accountability, and it shifts you from passive candidate to professional peer. And that's why mistake number 5 is don't leave the interviewer without confirming the next steps. Okay, so if you've made it this far in the video, you can see that none of these mistakes are actually about skill. They're about clarity, calm, authority, and control. And the senior executives who get hired, they know how to demonstrate these 4 things. So now you do know the 5 mistakes costing you 100K offers, and none of them were about skill. They were just about how much risk you created. And if you want future interviews to feel easy instead of unpredictable, you need to understand how hiring decisions actually work. And that's what I break down in this next video. So just watch this.